Amen. What does one say when we get to the sermon on Palm Sunday? This day begins in triumph, and it ends in utter loneliness and desertion. The crowd that spreads branches at Jesus' arrival in Jerusalem gives way to a crowd that demands the release of Barabbas instead. The disciples who followed Jesus' instructions willingly on the way into the city can't stay awake by the time we get to the scene in the garden. And by the end of the reading, the disciples seem to have vanished into thin air. Peter outright denies even knowing Jesus. The same disciple who just chapters earlier proclaims Jesus as the Messiah, and who just a few hours before declares his undying loyalty. Even the women who remain with him until the end watch on from a distance. Palm Sunday may be a day that starts in celebration, but it ends in the loneliness of the cross. In truth, this rejection of Jesus that we see in the Passion narrative is nothing new. Excuse me. It's been there throughout the gospel. Pastor and scholar William Carter writes that there is nothing violent about Jesus, yet there is something about him that people resist and wish to eliminate. We cannot single out empire or Sanhedrin for blame. There has been something that people have resisted from the very beginning of his ministry. When Jesus heals the withered hand of a man in the synagogue, Mark tells us that the Pharisees were hard of heart, and they began then to plot about how to destroy Jesus. When Jesus drove the demons out of a possessed man and into a herd of swine, you may remember that story, and the swine ran straight down the steep bank and into the lake and drowned. Well, all the people in the surrounding country of the Gerasenes were afraid, and they begged Jesus to leave their neighborhood. The event may have been a spectacular display of power and healing, but it disrupted their comfort zone and the way they understood the world. Being in the presence of Jesus was more than they could bear. When Jesus began to teach in the synagogue in his hometown of Nazareth, people wondered how a carpenter's son could have that kind of knowledge, and they took offense at him. Even the disciples found themselves uncomfortable at times in the presence of the Messiah. When Jesus tells the disciples that he must undergo great suffering and be killed, Peter pulls him aside and rebukes him. When confronted with the person of Jesus, there is something about him that makes the people who come face to face with him in the Gospels, and maybe us as well, uncomfortable. Is it that Jesus calls us to change the way we live? No matter how much we may pride ourselves on being adventurous, change doesn't come easy to us humans. We have a certain innate fear of the unknown. Is it that we, like the Pharisees, are afraid of the political and social ramifications that will ensue if we totally embrace Jesus? After all, the Pharisees had a right to be worried. In the Hebrew scriptures, the Messiah is pictured riding on a colt into Jerusalem, triumphant and victorious. Apparently, at least some people in the crowd made the connection between that messianic image and what Jesus himself is doing as he rides into Jerusalem. They spread out their cloaks and loudly proclaimed, "Blessed is the King who comes in the name of the Lord." No wonder the Pharisees tell Jesus to make his followers quiet down. The Roman government always stepped up its military presence in Jerusalem during Jewish festivals. It didn't take a rocket scientist to know that if things continued on this course, there would be a clash of power structures. Jesus' kingdom was subversive then, And if we embrace the way of Jesus and all its truth, it is still subversive today. It can upset our modern systems that are built on materialistic excess, the belief that might makes right, and the unending attempt to wall ourselves off from the needs and claims of others. Start to question these things, and society responds with an all-out 24-hour news channel assault. Or could the problem be that in Jesus, we come face to face with a perfect love? Now, there are many things that we call love in today's world, and I do believe that our love, no matter how imperfect, because our love is always imperfect, I still believe it participates in the divine love that God has for the world. But when we see Jesus looking at us from the cross, we see a love that acts without fear, a love stronger than any wrong committed against it, a love that endures even in the midst of absolute desertion, a love that empties itself completely to make room for us. The truth of that kind of love can be difficult to bear. It's enough to make us uncomfortable, maybe even nervous. Let's face it, perhaps for all of these reasons, a walk through Holy Week can be unsettling. We end up left with such questions as, well, what would it look like for me to empty myself and to be filled with that kind of love? What would it look like for this congregation to empty itself in love? Where are our Jerusalems, the places we are called to go, but we would rather not go? And what are the crosses that we're called to bear? What are the oppressive systems we participate in? And which ones are we called to confront? Yes, to truly walk with Jesus through Holy Week can make us uncomfortable. And yet, here we are, year after year. Why? I believe it's because we know that if we walk with Jesus all the way through to the end, we will find this way of the cross to be none other than the way of life.